In this video, I'm going to talk about sampling in research. Sampling is the specific question about who will be the subject of your research. To whom are you going to distribute your survey? Major issues related to sampling largely have to do with issues of generalizability. The idea that the people who we're studying, the samples or subsets of the population we choose to study, will shape the sorts of conclusions we're able to make. So it's important to think about who will be present in your study. A sort of systemic issue in the field of psychology was identified in the last 20 years, whereby we sort of realized that the vast majority of subjects who were participants in psychological studies that were published were overwhelmingly from Western cultures. The majority of those were participants from the United States. So the vast majority of research subjects that are the subject of scientific psychological study are either from the US or a similar Western culture. So over 90% of psychological research historically has been on a very specific sort of person. So the idea is that we really need to think more about sampling and how the people who we recruit into our surveys will sort of shape the conclusions that we can make. Psychology, it appears, has done a great job at trying to understand this very specific kind of person from a Western perspective and done a very limited job at understanding literally anyone else. And when we're saying anyone else, this means like billions of people in the world are highly underrepresented in psychological research. This basic bias has famously been given the WEIRD acronym. So the vast majority of participants in psychological research have been from this particular Western culture, relatively educated, and industrialized, rich, and democratic nation. So again, vast majority United States, Western Europe, Australia. These are the cultures that are highly represented. And the WEIRD acronym is meant to make us remember that our research is very skewed in the sort of people that we've historically tried to understand. So the WEIRD issue, this biased sample in psychological research, it's a real problem because it speaks to the fact that there's sort of a systemic racism built into the way we approach our scientific study. Based on the fact that we overwhelmingly recruit only certain kinds of people, it's sort of inherent that the field sort of implicitly says that they don't care about other sorts of people. And this is likely not particularly consciously done. It's likely that most psychology programs are in these cultures, but the question becomes why? Why is it that psychological research is primarily done in this sort of perspective? And why are psychological researchers primarily studying people that look like them and come from the same background as them? The WEIRD bias does not mean that psychology research is useless or wrong. It just means that psychology research has done a lot of great work at understanding this particular kind of person and done almost no work at understanding a really sizable proportion of the human population. If psychological science wants to claim that it's the study of people in general, we need to keep in mind that historically research has not reflected that. So this gets us into some basic terminology. The basic terminology we're going to deal with is population versus a sample. So a population is going to be every person within a group that shares some particular characteristic in common. So when we talk about population, most generally this could be humans. So all humans everywhere share the characteristic of being a human being. So the broadest population in the context of human subjects is everyone. Now, typically, if you're going to want to take a census where every subject, every person within a population is represented, this is obviously going to be logistically tricky. If the United States government, for example, wants to survey everyone in the United States for the 10-year census, right, that's within the logistical capabilities of the United States government. For most of us just doing research, we're stuck with samples. So a sample is just going to be a subset of the population who we can actively recruit into participation in our study. So we start by identifying our population of interest. What is the group in general that we're interested in? Again, most generally, this could be people, but maybe you're a clinical psychologist and your population of interest is depressed people. Even then, you're dealing with an overwhelmingly large underlying population of interest. People with depression are into the multi millions. So, even if you're dealing with a slightly more specific population than people in general, you're still largely going to have to be dealing with sampling. And so, you do have to think about whom you are sampling and how you're actively recruiting them into your survey. The reason is because just selecting a sample that is exclusively from your population of interest is not sufficient to ensure that the sample is representative of the population of interest. If there's anything that sets your sample apart in some way, based on the way they were chosen or elected to be part of your study, if there's some characteristic that makes that theoretical subset of participants unique, that may make them distinct from the population of interest, you are dealing with what we call a biased sample. A biased sample just means that based on the way the sample was chosen, the sample might be distinct from the population of interest. So let's say, for example, you're interested in people in general, that's your population of interest, and yet all of your sample were university students because that's the actual target sample that you can actively recruit into your survey. Well, you need to ask yourself, could it be that college students are distinct in some way from people in general? Yes, obviously, that's a different sort of a person. So just because all of your college students were from the population of interest is not enough to ensure that your biased sample of college students is perfectly representative of people in general. So, take, for example, political attitudes. This is the sort of variable that you can reasonably assume undergraduate samples of students are going to be distinct from the population in general of the United States. So the question really becomes, is my variable something that in particular my biased sample might be distinct on their levels of this variable? If so, then using your biased sample will lead to limited generalizability of your conclusions from your research. So we in particular care about our biased samples if we have reason to believe that our sample might be distinct on the variables we're currently studying. Some further terminology to ground us in the field of sampling. You want to start by identifying your population of interest. So, theoretical population, or as I often refer to it, population of interest, or POI. Then you have to limit yourself to the population you can actually get access to, so the study population. Let's say you're a researcher who's interested in maybe Americans in general, but you can only get access to university students because you can only access an undergraduate participant pool. The sampling frame is how you actually access your potential participants. So, sending out an anonymous link on Facebook, that would be an example of a sampling frame. Or maybe you just post a link to the SONA systems and wait for people to sign up. The sampling frame is how you actually reach out to your participants. Then the samples itself is who actually ends up in your study. The 100 people that you actually get to take your survey once you post your link to Facebook or Snapchat or whatever it may be, that is your actual sample. So the process of figuring out who you can access, how you're going to access them, and who actually gets to be in your study is a bit of a whittling down process. You start with the target population that you're interested in, and then you're left with whatever actual sample of n equals 50, whatever it may be, who actually took your survey. There's lots of different ways that our sampling methods are biased, either because we're sort of logistically restricted in what we can achieve, or sheer laziness. It just sort of depends. A really important example of a way that biased samples often come about is through what we call convenience. So this is what it sounds like. A convenience sample is just sampling whoever you can access quite easily. So you'll notice in research, that is published in the field of psychology, there's an overabundance of research done on college undergraduates. It's not that the field of psychology is overwhelmingly interested in college students. Some psychology researchers are interested in college students, but the vast majority of over reliance on undergraduate data is because this is who researchers can conveniently access. A lot of people doing research are professors at universities, and we have this ready undergraduate participant pool. So it's not that most researchers necessarily are fundamentally interested in college students as their population of interest. It's just that that's who we can easily access. Self selection is also a really important way that biased sampling ends up shaping who we recruit in our survey. When you guys post your survey link to your Facebook or wherever you might post it, you're sort of at the mercy of who's actually willing to be in your survey. So if you're just relying on volunteers to self select and agree to participate in your survey, maybe there's something about participants who elected to be in your survey that made them distinct. Maybe people who self select and who voluntarily go into the process of taking a survey, maybe they're more agreeable. Maybe they're more bored. There might be any number of characteristics that make people distinct based on the fact that they were just willing to be in your survey. So, a lot of the times, we're at the mercy of who we can conveniently access, and we're at the mercy of who's actually willing to be in our survey. This is just going to be the sort of natural logistical restraint that most researchers, let's be honest, are dealing with. Now, I want to point to a kind of a fun, in my opinion, I don't know if y'all are fans of United States history. I think it's fun to bring in historical examples when relevant. Really famously, the topic of sampling is relevant to a famous United States presidential election from 1936. This is a fun example, again, in my opinion, so I'm going to sort of walk you through the historical context and then talk about why sampling is relevant. So, the Literary Digest was an American periodical that famously, for decades before the 1936 presidential election, had accurately predicted who was going to be the winner of the election. The candidates in 1936 was incumbent FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, against Alf Landon. Now, based on the Literary Digest's polling, where they tried to create the data that would enable them to make their prediction, they found that about 1.3 respondents that they were able to access indicated that they would be voting for Alf Landon. Under a million indicated that they would be voting for incumbent FDR. So the Literary Digest predicted that Alf Landon would win the 1936 election in a landslide. And if you're wondering why you've never heard of President Alf Landon, it's because the Literary Digest was way wrong. They were way off. FDR won re election in a landslide. What did the Literary Digest do wrong? Well, you need to think about the context of the United States at this historical period, and you need to have an understanding of how exactly the Literary Digest was accessing the people who participated in their survey. To start off, the historical context is that 1936 was during the decade of the Great Depression in the United States, and it was after a term of FDR's presidential administration where he initiated what was called the New Deal. Essentially, as a strategy to deal with the mass economic suffering of the Great Depression, FDR created a slew of social programs, including unemployment insurance, food stamps. All of these were programs designed to help poor people out of their dire economic circumstances. Now, not everyone liked the New Deal. Rich people kind of hated it because their taxes went up. They thought that these were all a series of handouts, but you know who loved the New Deal? The poor people who got to benefit by feeding themselves and being able to afford the cost of living. What exactly happened? It comes down to sort of the story goes the Literary Digest had a series of biased sampling strategies, of which it's rumored they called people on landlines. A lot of people about this story will say that one of the issues is that only rich people at the time had telephones, and as such, the Literary Digest was only able to call rich people on the telephone. So their biased sampling by only reaching out to people who had telephones and who, as such, were likely to be more rich meant that they were oversampling from wealthy individuals who were not likely to want to vote for FDR. That part of the story might be somewhat apocryphal. Apparently, historically, phones weren't that uncommon, but other features of the Literary Digest sampling strategy apparently included using car registration records to access people and reach out to them. That's obviously going to be something that only wealthy people in the 1930s were typically able to afford. So, definitely, car registration records, as the story goes, was partly responsible for this biased sampling. Another feature of their sampling was that they relied on people who subscribed to the magazine, filling out their polling opinions, and sending it back to the magazine. Therein, you have a built in self selection bias. Who's likely to want to go through the effort of filling out a poll and mailing it back to a magazine? Probably people who are kind of disillusioned with the current administration. There was likely a self selection issue whereby participants were only actually bothering to send their responses in if they were like super pissed about the current FDR administration. So they were oversampling likely people who were sort of fired up, of which people who are fired up are likely to largely be people who are voting against the incumbent. Overall, they had a quite low response rate, meaning that there's this what we call non response bias. So people who are likely not bothering to fill out the survey were likely a lot of those Roosevelt voters. So, overall, again, hopefully this was somewhat interesting. Again, I like historical examples. This is just a really famous example from United States history where these issues of sampling led to a really sort of embarrassing mistaken conclusion on the part of this previously eminent American periodical. So, as the story goes, the Literary Digest was completely embarrassed by their terrible polling, and it was all because of their terrible sampling, and the magazine folded some years later. So, goes to show you that sort of the consequences of using poor sampling techniques to create mistaken conclusions, it can lead to some sort of unpleasant consequences. So, in thinking about this idea of whether biased samplings actually matters for your purpose, you're almost certainly going to be dealing with biased samplings in your project, and a lot of research in general is going to be dealing more often than not with a biased sample. This doesn't negate the usefulness of our research. What you have to do is just think about whether or not your sample is distinct from your population of interest in some way, and then ask whether it matters for your purposes. If the way in which your sample is distinct from the population of interest doesn't really have any bearing on your constructs that you're currently studying, maybe the biased sample doesn't altogether matter that much. You just have to sort of do the thought exercise of asking yourself if your biased sample could lead to mistaken conclusions for your current research question. Additionally, I would at this point encourage you to not think about these study flaws and limitations as sort of negating the usefulness of the research. This is just something that we have to acknowledge. As researchers, when we're communicating the value of our research, make sure that you take into consideration that you should really be acknowledging the limitations and flaws of your study. In my opinion, it doesn't negate the value of a study. As researchers in this manuscript that I've linked here, on how to write a scientific manuscript that oddly enough appeared in the journal Blood Transfusion. I don't know, it's a great paper. I don't know why it's in Blood Transfusion, but I highly recommend it. Basically, the authors of this particular publication said that we actually strengthen the validity and value of our science when we fully, openly acknowledge the limitations and weak points of our particular research study, because that opens the door for improved versions of the study in the future. So never think that your study limitations sort of tank the value of your research, just acknowledge them. So now I'm going to walk through some more specific strategies for sampling and talk about them in terms of your more biased versus your more representative sampling strategies. So I'm going to start with what we call our probability-based sampling. This is going to be a set of sampling methods that aim to get more representative samples. So the most representative way to recruit a sample from your survey in a way that will make it still a subset of the population, but not as unbiased as possible, is going to be to put every single participant in that population sort of in a hat, put the names in, and then just choose a certain number to pull out, meaning that every single subject within the population of interest has a perfectly equal chance of being picked. So this is random sampling. Don't confuse this as random assignment. Random sampling is a sampling strategy whereby you ensure that every single member of the POI has an equal probability of being chosen to be in the sample itself. So this is obviously not going to be easy to do if you have very large populations of interest, but let's say you're interested in drinking behavior at Miami. Maybe you're an administrator at Miami, so reasonably it might be within your capability to just get a current roster of every Miami undergraduate, say I'm going to pull 500 Miami students, and you send out specific emails just to those students. That would be random sampling. Again, if you're dealing with a large population of interest, random sampling is likely not going to be logistically feasible. Stratified sampling is again a more probability-based strategy. This is when you make it so that your sample sort of forcibly or artificially contains certain units from various segments of your population. So we can also call this proportional random sampling. Basically, you divide your population into some relevant set of subgroups, and you make sure to randomly sample each subgroup. So let's say you want to make sure you have really even gender balance within your sample. You might divide your population of interest into men and women, and you take a random sample of the women and a random sample of the men to ensure that there's a perfectly even 50-50 breakdown of gender within your sample. So you could also do this with maybe ethnicity to ensure that your sample has the same proportional demographic makeup on ethnicity. You would want to think about the proportion of those ethnicity breakdowns from your population of interest, and you take a sample from each of those ethnicity subgroups to make sure that they have some representation within your sample. So again, if it's ethnic diversity and representation that you're looking for, that would be the relevant subgroup that you create. So anytime you use stratified sampling, proportional random sampling, it's about identifying a relevant subgroup from your population of interest and make sure to take a random sample from those relevant subgroups. Cluster sampling is going to be, it's going to start somewhat simple, similar to your stratified sampling. In this case, groups within the population of interest are randomly selected. Then every individual within any particular cluster that you selected is surveyed. So this is different from stratified sampling in that you identify relevant subgroups and you pick subgroups to sample in their entirety. So I think something like um, voting district breakdowns within a state, like let's say the state of New York, as you can see there, is broken down into a series of voting districts. If I wanted to use cluster sampling to survey people and their political attitudes in the state of New York, I might just choose 5 clusters, meaning 5 voting districts, and then I would poll every single person within that district. So you could see there's one district there on Long Island, there's a few in the middle of New York, and I would make sure that every single voter within those 5 specified clusters were identified. So this starts somewhat similar to stratified in that your population of interest is divided into subgroups, but in cluster sampling, any chosen cluster or subgroup is surveyed in its entirety. So these are all your probability-based sampling methods. They're meant to create as representative a sample as possible. So you're still taking a smaller sample from the population of interest, but you're trying to make sure that it's not overly biased. But obviously these methods are not going to be necessarily practical or doable for many research projects. So it depends on the nature of your population. Do you have a population that you can easily identify every single member of that population? What precision do you care about in your research? So, are there any particular generalizations you're hoping to make? If so, you can think through whether your particular biased approach for sampling is okay. And then additionally, you're bound by your practical considerations, meaning your sort of logistical resources. Who are you able to reach out to? How are you able to access your population and your potential sample? So then, if we're talking our non-probability methods, one of the primary non-probability or more biased sampling strategies is going to be your convenience sampling that I've covered. Basically, if you're only recruiting people who are easy to access, whoever you're friends with on Facebook, your undergraduate participant pool at Miami, that's your convenience sampling. But a slightly more representative non-probability sampling is going to be what we call quota sampling. So as I mentioned, convenience sampling, again, this is when you just use convenience as the basis for who's sampled into your survey. A lot of the times researchers are sort of stuck using their own convenience, not necessarily because we're lazy, but because convenience does to a certain extent shape who we're actually able to access. But again, take into account the whole weird issue in psychology. Being too complacent and overly relying on convenience can certainly lead us to some sort of systemic flaws within our scientific fields. Now, on to quota sampling, which is a more complicated approach to a relatively non probability sampling strategy. This is going to look similar to our stratified sampling strategy, but it is distinct. So I'm going to define quota sampling, and then I'm going to describe the difference between stratified and quota. So again, it's going to start similar with the identification of subsets or subgroups of the population of interest. From there, set target quotas for how many people you want from each subset. Like I said, this does certainly appear to be the same thing as stratified random sampling, but it's not, in that once you identify the subgroups, you are not using random sampling. You are non-randomly going to select people into the various subgroups. So you do want to hit those target ends for your various subgroups, but how those subgroups are chosen is not done randomly. So I'm going to explain what makes something quota versus stratified. So again, they both start with the target POI broken down into subgroups. So let's say I'm interested in American smokers and I want to make sure to have some good age diversity and representation because I think smoking attitudes or behaviors might be different depending on age group. So I want to get that good diversity and representation. A stratified random sampling approach would mean that once I identify my age groups, I still need to have access to every smoking American and randomly select a certain amount from the various age demographics. So, if I want to have some representation of smoking teenagers in America, I would basically need to have a list of every single American teenager who smoked, and they would all need to have an equal likelihood of being recruited. So, sort of akin to putting the name of every single American smoking teenager into a hat and picking out a certain number. So, with stratified, there is still that modicum of random ish sampling that leads us to more representative samples. Now, quota, on the other hand, is going to be a bit more doable. For your quota sampling, if you need, let's say, 40 participants in each of your smoking age groups, I would just non randomly find the first 40 smoking teenagers I could find. So I go to the local high school and recruit 40 teenagers who smoke. I need 40 smoking young adults, so I'm just going to go to a local bar where I know they hang out. And the older adults, maybe I go to a local nursing home. So the idea is that there might be something distinct about that local high school that makes those teenagers different from Americans in general. There might be something different about that particular nursing home that makes those elderly individuals different from Americans, older Americans who smoke in general. So again, quota sampling, it is good for getting diversity on whatever specific variable you're breaking down into subgroups. So I still get in this example, the age diversity that I need, but it still does not have that perfect random sampling that would enable me to have a more accurate representation of the population of interest. But again, that has to be weighed against the considerations that obviously this quota approach is going to be leaps and bounds easier than a stratified approach. Okay, so here's just a nifty flow chart to help guide your studying of your various sampling strategies. There's more sampling strategies that exist out there than just the ones that I covered. You should just be responsible for being familiar with the ones that I covered here in this lecture, because again, there's a lot. I just picked my favorites. And like I mentioned, make sure that you're not confusing this term of random sampling with random assignment. I know I've been talking about random assignment a lot and talking about your guys' experiments. Random assignment means all of your participants have an equal chance of being in any of your conditions, so an equal chance of being in your experimental or your control condition. This is important for your experiment to have internal validity to help make causal claims. Random sampling is about sampling strategies that help external validity or generalizability. So make sure not to get these two confused, even though they sound similar. So then thinking about some discussion points on sampling, start thinking about to whom your survey will be distributed and how this strategy will lead to a slightly biased sampling. How you would, in an ideal world, make your sample more representative and the extent to which you care. So that's going to do it for this discussion on sampling.